whatever, get back in here. And we're going to get into the book of Matthew, talking about salt and light today. We've been going through this sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount, which is Jesus' probably one of the most recognizable parts of Jesus' teaching, I would say, by and large. And so we're going to carry on through that. So today we're getting into salt and light. But if you were like, but last week Rob just talked on like the first couple of the Beatitudes, when are we going to do the rest of the Beatitudes? Well, good for you for paying attention, because Rob is going to come back. I'm going to do salt and light this week, and then to the fulfillment of the law next week. And then Rob's going to go back, and we're going to finish up those Beatitudes. So I'm going to keep making mention to the Beatitudes, but he's going to cover the sermon later on. So does that make sense to everybody? Sort of, kind of? Good. So today we're on salt and light. They have this saying, when I was in Mexico, they would say, like if you order a beer, I hope this is not inappropriate for this crew here, but if you order a beer in Mexico, they put a little bowl of salt on the table and lime. And if you order tacos in Mexico, they put this little bowl of salt on the table and lime. And if you order mango and the mango's not quite ripe, they put a little bit of salt and some lime. They have this saying, it's todos con sal y limón, which just means everything gets salt and lime. And it's like salt and lime is they put it on literally everything. Like, you can't get away from the salt and the lime. And I would say life has improved generally because of it. Like, I didn't think I liked salt and lime in my beer, but then all of a sudden I'm having a Corona and I'm going, you know what, this is not too bad of an idea. But in its own context, it works. But in the hot countries, they get after the salt thing quite a bit. So when we were in Turkey and Israel, and I've spent time in Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico as well, and all of those places, they get after salt. You'll see it in Turkey. Like, when you wake up in the morning, you go down to the breakfast table, and there's just olives there. Like, anybody want green olives, like, first thing in the morning? You could have it. You could, yeah, good. I took them. I thought they were pretty good. And and not just like one or two, but like 12 different kinds. Now, I don't suppose everybody wakes up with 12 different kinds of olives, but, you know, the group we were with sure did. And they said this is just a part of every meal. And then they got real salty cheeses that they served there too. And you're kind of going like, man, like, the blood pressure of these people just must be like through the roof, right? Like, how do you survive in this culture and not just suffer from the blood pressure? And then we went out hiking in the afternoon sun. I had to get one of those real nerdy, you know, like the Gilligan hats, like the full brim sun hats. I had to get it. I didn't choose it. I chose the cool one. And if you're imagining a cool looking sun hat, then you're going, it wasn't cool. And you're right, it wasn't cool. It was the coolest I could find. But I wore that thing out hiking, and then after the first day, of course, this is a little gross, but I just completely sweated through my hat because it's like 45 degrees out and we're hiking. And then I get back, and then the next morning, there's just the white salt line around there. And I'm going, that's why we have to eat so much salt. And that's why we put salt in our water, and that's why we have all these electrolytes, because you just sweat it out, you lose it. And salt means a lot, and especially in the ancient Near Eastern time, like, you needed salt on your food in order, as a matter of survival. It was a priority of living. Like, you needed to have that thing. And so salt gets a lot of play in the Bible, and we don't always maybe appreciate it or understand where they're coming from. And I was surprised to learn that salt goes back all the way through the Bible. It's in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's kind of pervades that whole culture. Like, salt's a really valuable thing. Like, in ancient Rome, they used to I understand that they paid their soldiers were worth their weight in salt. That saying that we have, a person's worth their weight in salt or whatever, worth their salt, that comes from Rome, because their soldiers would get this special coin and they would use it toward the purchase of salt, and it was called sal, S-A-L, which is the Latin for salt and Spanish for salt as well, sal y limon. They would get their salarium, which is where we get our word salary from. And so it was like linked into like a person really is worth their salt. Like, that's a kind of a primary economic reality. And so the Jews have this throughout their culture, like hospitality-wise. If a neighbor moves in next door, you meet them with bread and salt. Like that's the classic thing. And they still do this. Like this is still a reality of life. And so there's a lot of cultural stuff happening here. And in particular, if you go even farther back, like Jesus is not the first person to use this, like Cicero, who was just before Jesus' time, he's got this saying. Cicero was like a Roman politician. He was a consul, and that's like a very high office the highest office that you can have, or second highest, I guess. The next highest office is for retired consuls. So it was a big deal. He was a philosopher and like one of the most prolific orators of the Roman period, but he wrote this about friendship, and he lived 106 BC to 43 BC. He says, as in the case of wines that improve with age, the oldest friendships ought to be the most delightful. Moreover, the well-known adage is true. Men must eat many a peck of salt together before the claims of friendship are fulfilled. You just imagine, like, you're imagining this the way I was imagining it when I first read it, that guys just sit down at the table and just start eating salt. Like, if you've ever, like, tried to put sugar in your coffee and it was actually salt and then you taste it, you spit that junk out of your mouth. It's nasty and disgusting, right? So they're not actually sitting down and eating salt together. What he's referring to, and there was a little footnote in my thing that refers to Aristotle, who talks about this as well. Aristotle was around 350 BC. He goes even further back. He says, such friendships, this is Aristotle now, require time and familiarity. As the proverb says, men cannot know each other till they have eaten salt together, nor can they admit each other to friendship or be friends till each has been found lovable and been trusted by each. Those who quickly show the marks of friendship to each other wish to be friends, but are not friends unless they both are lovable and know the fact. For a wish for friendship may arise quickly, but friendship does not. This idea of eating salt together is what they would do in the ancient Near Eastern culture. They would have a conflict. And then they would go, I don't like the looks of this guy. I don't trust this person. I don't like this person. Whatever their conflict was, they would be out of sorts with each other. And then when they reconciled, when they figured it out, they would sit down at a table and they would eat bread and salt. They would exchange bread and salt together as a way of covenanting in relationship to each other. And you're like, you covenant with salt? Like a covenant of salt? Is this familiar to anybody, that phrase, covenant of salt? It was new to me as well, but check this out. This is just a little bit surprising to me. This is the Old Testament, Leviticus 2, verse 13, and talking about salt and sacrifice. So Leviticus has a lot of the rules around sacrifice that God gives the Israelites. He says, season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all of your offerings. Okay. And then 2 Chronicles 13:5, talking about David, it says, don't you know that the Lord, the God of Israel, has given the kingship of Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt? Don't you know that? I didn't. I was like, oh, I mean, I knew he was the king. I didn't realize, what's this covenant of salt thing about? But they used salt because salt, especially in that time, is like indestructible. You could not burn it. It doesn't burn. It needs like thousands of degrees of heat in order for salt to be destroyed by fire, and it just doesn't do it, which is why we use it to melt ice here, right? The melting point is very high. That's how that works. So this is a one commentator, and I'll just read him because I didn't totally understand this, but it kind of sheds light on this whole covenant of salt thing together. It says this, Gordon Wenham thinks that this phrase suggests that salt symbolized the covenant itself. In company with numerous scholars, Greeks and Arabs, he notes, are known to have eaten salt together when they concluded covenants. As we will see, in the Old Testament, salt is explicitly connected with covenant on two further occasions, and in both a covenant of salt means an eternal covenant. And he cites Numbers and Chronicles. This is so because salt was something that could not be destroyed by fire or time or any other means within antiquity. The addition of salt to the offering was a reminder that the worshiper was in an eternal covenant relationship with his God. This meant that the worshiper had a perpetual duty to uphold and keep the covenant law. Such perpetual duty would account for the recurrence of salt in the text. All right. So basically what it's saying is when we're talking about salt, the Israelites are understanding there's this like primary economic force, this thing that's of great value and super important, and there's a sense of God's covenant being echoed with inside of this covenant of salt, that when Jesus is talking about you are the salt of the earth, he's saying you are this thing which brings permanence, which they use to preserve stuff, right? Like you salt meat so that it stays, you don't have refrigeration, so it keeps it around, it keeps it from putrefying or going bad, as it were. And so there's a sense of like purity or purification with salt. They used to scrub their babies with salt when they were born, and you're like, that's weird, right? But then you remember that when we went to the Dead Sea, they have all of these kind of like mineral scrubs and salt scrubs and skin so soft and things like that, it would be that kind of an idea. But there's a purifying, cleansing element to salt. It's used as a preservative to keep things pure and right and good. And so when Jesus is launching into this thing, there's just a lot of like cultural, biblical understanding around the idea of salt. So not to confuse anybody, but hopefully that brings a little bit of clarity to what Jesus is saying, because Jesus has just finished the Beatitudes. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You, those people that Jesus was just talking to, you are the salt of the earth. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. So we need to understand that when Jesus is saying, you are the salt of the earth, who is he talking? This is an extension of the Beatitudes, of the people he's addressing in the Beatitudes. And if we want to find out who he's talking to in the Beatitudes, we just jump back to chapter 4. At the very end, it says, Jesus, in verse 23, Jesus went through Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. So he's in the Galilee. There's a lot of Jews in the Galilee, right? News about him spread all over Syria. Not as many out there. And people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed. And he healed them. Large crowds from the Galilee, the Decapolis, which is Roman, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. A follower of Jesus is called a disciple. That's what that word means. They were disciples of Jesus. And then it goes on, when Jesus saw the crowds, these crowds of these people constituted of the sick, poor, marginalized, oppressed people from all over the ancient world, when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. His disciples, those people following, and came to him, and he began to teach them. And he said, blessed are the poor in spirit. He's talking to them. These are the people who the Beatitudes is directed to, both his disciples as we think of them, but he doesn't actually have all of his disciples yet. This is only chapter 5. He's only got a few disciples that are following him in that full-time kind of way already. He hasn't called the rest of the disciples yet. So these people that he's addressing this Sermon on the Mount to, at least in Matthew, is going to be these crowds of people. This is who the Beatitudes are for. And when he says, you are the salt of the earth, this is who Jesus is talking to. He's not just saying like these specific set of oh my goodness, I can't. this specific little grouping of Jews or whatever that are following. It's not the 3 people. It's not the 4 people that are with him. It's not just the 12 that are going to be with him. It's this whole crew of people that are with Jesus. You are the salt of the earth. And that's what makes them salty, right? We want to ask ourselves the question, what does it mean to be salty? Right? Because he says, if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything. So we go, well, I want to be salty. How do I be salty? What's that mean? And he's defining it here in the Beatitudes. We have to go back and go, these are the people who are choosing, instead of to be full of like just easy answers and life is good and we don't have to think about it, they're choosing to be hungry. And they're hungering for righteousness. They hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are people who don't just sit by passively and allow things to happen, but who go out actively and make peace. They are peacemakers. That is a thing to do. That's a task to put your hand to. It's not just saying, I believe in peace and we should all be loving and then just go on with your life with nothing changed. It's like, no, I need to now go find brokenness and bring peace in the place of brokenness. That's an active thing. He's talking to those who are merciful, who have chosen to act with mercy and saying that they will be shown mercy. And he's talking to the pure in heart. And so this is what makes a person salty. And this covenant, if this author who I was reading about is right about this covenant of salt, and it's in the Bible, we talk about that a lot. And covenants, as you know, are lasting, perpetual, eternal, long-term things that God engages in. So we have a way of participating with God in this covenant of salt by saying, we will be salty. And Jesus is saying, this is what it looks like. Here's the Beatitudes. Here's my basic teaching on like the ethic of Jesus and understanding and interpreting the whole Old Testament law and all of this stuff as we're going to move through the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is saying, this is what it looks like to be salty. And you need to be salty. You can lose this thing. So he says, you are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? And that begs the question, can salt lose its saltiness? I guess it can. When we were in Israel, again, at the Dead Sea, they said, I think if I remember the stat right, Yehuda said that there was enough salt in the Dead Sea to provide for the entire world's salt supply for the next 100 years or something like that, 80 or 100 years. If they only used the Dead Sea, they would have enough in there just for the whole earth from the Dead Sea for the next 100 years. There's a ton of it inside of there. And yet it is this very, very valuable commodity. And so you see this thing represented throughout the Old Testament in a variety of kind of ways. You see this covenant of salt that God is making with his people, and you see that there is like salt, which is a blessing and talks about reconciliation. It has this preservative effect. It has this purifying effect. But then you also see the other side of salt, which is that when you take over your enemy's land and you burn their fields and you throw salt on the ground, you salt the ground so that nothing will grow. And it's kind of like a sign of barrenness, right? And then he talks about the wastelands being like a salted wasteland in the Bible. And so it's this picture of like unproductive land, unfruitful, unuseful, not doing what it needs to do. And then in the next example, would maybe and the most obvious would be Lot's wife, right? So there's all kinds of like awfulness happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. And the Lord is calling Lot and his family away from this to follow him. And then as they're going, he says, don't look back. don't do the thing. Don't eat the fruit. Don't look back. And as they're leaving, Lot's wife looks back. And she's turned into a pillar of salt. And you're like, wow, that's interesting. Interesting imagery there. I'm not exactly sure. I don't have all the answers on what exactly that's about. But we see that salt is used to talk about a cursing as well. And so here is this pillar of salt. And what has she done? Her heart has gone, I think I might want this thing more. I want to look back and see where it's at. I'm still like, reminds me of like Jesus saying, like, whoever puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not fit for the kingdom of God. Right? This is like going, okay, I'm with you, God, but man, my heart is back here. And then boom, she's lost her saltiness. Or you could say, has just become salt. Like she's left all of the salt there, and now it's become an unproductive, unhelpful, not good thing, but a thing of judgment and cursing for Sodom. So, this plays into our passage this morning as well. Salt is good, but if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? So apparently around the Dead Sea, there's a soil type, I can't remember exactly what it is, but if you mix salt in with it, the salt becomes essentially just kind of inert. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't taste it, it loses its saltiness. By nature of being mixed in too thoroughly and not being set apart, not being pure, not being what it is on its own. And yet there's this really interesting thing because, I think the metaphor would be like when we mix too thoroughly, we lose our saltiness, right? And this is talked about in the New Testament. Again, Paul and others will pick up this, and I just haven't noticed it because I haven't paid attention to it really much before. But in Colossians, it says, "Be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be always full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone." Like we need to keep this thing with us. And so there's an expectation that we are salty, but we're going into the world. We're in the world, but not of the world, right? As Jesus talks about. We participate, but not to be diluted by the world, but to be able to be a presence, to have that sort of the flavor of Christ with us, bringing that in as our missionary kind of sending and obligation. Where this is talked about in Mark, the parallel passage to this in Mark is in Mark 9:49 to 50. It says, "Everyone will be salted with fire." That's kind of the judgment side of things, right? But again, they would, remember, sprinkle salt onto their sacrifices, and salt doesn't burn, so salt is this thing that remains. And so in a sense, there's a way of going, even through the fire, and if you're channeling James and Peter, then you're going, yeah, they understand this like fire. The salt remains. Everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can you make it salty or good? Have salt among yourselves and be at peace with each other. So there's a sense that if we become diluted, if we become too much of the world that's around us and less of this thing that God calls us and tells us who we are, if we allow the world to define us, then we begin to lose our saltiness. We begin to lose our distinction, which is Christ, which is what it looks like in the Beatitudes to be able to respond, right? These people live in the world. The poor in spirit live in this world, but they're not integrated with it, right? Those who are mourning live in this world, but they mourn for something other than what the world mourns for. They mourn as Christ mourns. They mourn as God mourns. The meek are in this world. The world doesn't make much of them, but they're not playing by the rules of the world, right? And Christ says, "Blessed are the meek, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the poor in spirit." Those who are hunger and thirst for righteousness are in the world, and by nature of being in the world, their hunger and thirst for righteousness is increased. They need it. They're hungry for it because it's not there. They haven't experienced it in its fullness because they're in the world. It's a choice to remain hungry rather than to fill ourselves with the other things. The merciful are shown mercy. These are people who are in the world, and they're going, "Oh man, I want to get even. I want revenge. I want what the world wants in this thing, but I'm not going to do it. I have received this incredible mercy from God that I did not deserve, and now I will be merciful as well." They live in the world, but they're not of it. And the pure in heart, who have kept themselves from being defiled, blessed are they, the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers who go about, really, it's almost like meddling, isn't it? Like, you're going like, there's brokenness. I can do something about that. I can bring reconciliation. I can help to bring peace into this circumstance. But it's going to take some work for me. Like anybody that gets involved, you're going to get dirty. You're going to get the stink on you of whatever kind of fight and conflict's going on. But you come in as peacemakers going, I know that there is a way to bring peace into this thing. And so we're in the world, but not of the world. And then finally, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're persecuted for all of these things. Nobody likes when we get involved and we don't play by the rules that the world plays by. They're not going to like that. It's not easy to appreciate. It can come off the wrong way, but it's a giving of self that says, I'm not of this world. I have a citizenship to another kingdom, to another king, to my King Jesus. And so when we move into the world in that way, we become salt to the world. And we bring the flavor of Christ, or the aroma of Christ that it talks about in other parts of the New Testament. And people go, this is the distinctive. This is how Christians act. This is what it means to be a Christian, to be one of those people who follows after the ways of Jesus, because they're showing mercy and they're setting themselves aside in purity, but they're continuing to integrate. They're continuing to come to the table, to have the conversation, to figure out how to live here and show that mercy, and to hunger and thirst for righteousness and not be filled yet, but to know that they will be filled. To continue that hunger in the midst of all of this kind of stuff is how we become salt in the world. But if salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. This idea of a covenant of salt that lasts for a long time. This is this eternal covenant, right? We have a way of participating inside of that. We have a way of showing up. And it should be evident here. Like we start here, right? Start in your family. Start with your spouse. Start the most local, the closest relationships you have. Go, what does it look like for me to be salt in this relationship? What does it look like for me to stay salty here? And then ask God, go, how do I approach this? What do I talk about? What will I say? How I will respond? And if my last week of living is any example, you can blow it, and it's still not too late. And I know what it says. It says, how can it be made salty again? And I prayed those words going, Lord, I blew it. How can I be made salty again? He goes, well, asking for forgiveness is kind of a salty thing to do. Moving in humility is kind of a salty thing to do. Being patient, being kind, being compassionate, not keeping a record of wrongs, kind of a salty thing to do. Being humble enough to apologize and say, I'm sorry, is kind of a salty thing to do. And so there is a way of maintaining that saltiness. But then, again, we're moving back to poor in spirit and meek and some of these things that we don't associate with, like a lot of the feel good, I want to do that thing kind of stuff. But there is a way to be salty. And so then we move. We start there, start with these closest relationships, and then move out and just keep asking that question of, Lord, what does it look like for me to be salt in my employment, like at the place that I work, and how I treat maybe my employees or my boss or my coworkers or whatever it is, how I treat them will say something about my saltiness, right? Will say, I will be representing my king. Am I representing my king? And then keep moving out. And man, get it into social media if it's possible. Holy smokes. Like that needs a good heavy dose of salt. Like a lot. All the salt you could throw at it. Put it into social media too. Because we have to keep asking that question. This last week, when the Olympics had their like big opening ceremony, and then there's a bunch of Christians that were like really offended because it looked a lot like the LGBTQ community that was doing their like display or ceremony thing was like mimicking the Last Supper of the Lord, and there was some parallel pictures that I think kind of make that like an undeniable link to like this is what we're doing. And so people were like outraged, and they were saying all kinds of stuff on the internet about it and how wrong and awful and deplorable and God's gonna judge them, and oh man, yeah, oh wow, they just went for it, right? And I'm asking myself the question, going like, are we? Is that a salty response, or is it like, I mean, salty in the way that we would say, man, that guy's kind of salty about that thing. But I think it was not very Christ honoring in a lot of the stuff I saw. And we have to keep asking that question. And so I was asking it to this community of people I'm a part of. I'm like, what does it look like to respond and bring the flavor of Christ, to be gracious and compassionate, to be loving, to give voice to Christ. Because here's the deal. If we don't do it, it won't be done. It's our responsibility. We're the body of Christ. He's given us that thing. In this covenant of salt that he's given us that thing. And Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. Jesus is not himself. We are the salt of the earth. If we follow him, if we're his disciples, if we're going to be like him, we have to represent him in all of our conversations. And man, being down in the United States for the last couple of weeks during the election, I was on an airplane from North Carolina where I was visiting my Green Beret buddy who's going to ship out overseas today. And then I was on my way to my parents' house, and then my brother was going to be there, and there's a mixed bag of political views. And on the flight over, they shoot at Trump and have that attempted assassination thing. And I'm like, oh, this will be fun. How do we, are we going to, you just can't really talk about it too much, right? But man, how we talk about politics, the kind of confidence that we put into our leaders, and this is true for prime ministers, and how we talk about politics as well. The kind of expectation that we put on our leaders, and in these conversations go, if only this person were in, then God's will would be done, and this is God's candidate for this. Or the opposite of that, which is to say, I'm pretty sure this person's the Antichrist. I'm like, oh my goodness, we've done nothing but vote in the Antichrist for the last 100 years. Every single time somebody gets voted in that person doesn't want, they're the Antichrist. There it is again. It's how is Jesus on the throne, or is Jesus not on the throne? And are we representing that in the way that we're talking? Do we have that confidence, and is it coming through in the way that we talk about politics? Is it coming through in the way that we talk about our fears and concerns? Do we have that confidence in Jesus? And if so, are we communicating it? And Paul says this in Colossians 4. He says, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. On the internet, let's just say. Be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. There are opportunities abounding right now. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. I believe inside of here, the seasoned with salt has reconciliation in mind. It has this covenant, this thing that God is calling us into. And so as we have these conversations, Christ is asking us to be wise in the way that we have them. And Paul is telling the Colossians, be wise in the way that you act toward outsiders. Make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation always be full of grace, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to answer everyone. And there is a good answer. There is a way to represent Christ our King and our confidence in our King. And that job, that response, is evangelization. And I know it maybe sounds like a big, scary word, but that is evangelization. Is go, you know what? I just believe God's in charge of this thing. I'm accepted. I don't have to get panicky or worried about this thing. And that calm confidence can break through. But it's not easy. It's not easy. So we've been talking a little bit for the last number of months about starting missional communities in our homes this fall probably. And so we're going to be doing that, launching those things more officially as the fall gets on. But we were thinking in the meantime, there's just nothing wrong with Christians getting together. So I wanted to encourage everybody and say, if you can just find maybe say one other couple or two other couples that you'd be willing to get together with, that you would say, I will break bread with these people. I will eat a meal with these people. It'll be bread and salt between me and these people. And get together and have that meal. And then this is your whole job as a missional community so far, okay? You don't have to go any more than this. Do one thing while you meet together. Have a meal, enjoy it, enjoy each other's company, talk about the Red Sox, talk about whatever you want to talk about, and then do this one thing. Pray. Nobody's talking about the Red Sox, are they? I think that's the first time that's ever been said in this church. Pray, pray that God would begin to lay on your heart collectively a mission. That he would begin to move missionally in your lives and say, God, how are you calling us to lay hold of your mission, to pick up the mission that you have here in Princeton or beyond, whatever how our sphere of influence overlaps with each other, whatever that is, Lord, help, just put it on our hearts. Pray about that thing. Ask God to reveal that to you as a group, and then go home and pray about that thing. And then come back and compare notes and go, oh, look at that. God answers prayer. Because I'm very convinced that God is going to be revealing these things to you, that you will soon have a mission on your hands. And I think this is a beautiful thing to go about. And then talk about these kind of things. How do we be salty? What does it look like for us to be salt and light into the world? We didn't really talk about light, but I'm way over, so we're not going to. We'll talk about that another time. But that's what light does, is it reveals things that were previously hidden, things that were in need of exposure of the truth. And so, as we do this, it's my hope that we can become salt and that we can together figure out what it means. How do we respond together? Because our together response really matters. Let's pray. Father, you have given us everything that we need to be salt. Because you were merciful to us. You had mercy on us when we didn't deserve it. When we deserved judgment and wrath, you came and took our place. You brought reconciliation and restoration where there was brokenness and despair and hopelessness, and you brought hope. God, help us to communicate our gratitude for who you are and what you've done to the world around us, and so doing, that we might be salty. That this community would stand as more than just, a whatever Christian community box that the world's going to put us into. Lord, help us to transcend that. Not in ways of our own devising or making or cleverness, but in how you call us to participate, to be in this world, to be salt and light in this world, but not of this world. God, we ask that you would help us to discern that and to go together to be supported by each other, that we might be salt to each other as well. And that as we ask for wisdom in these conversations that we're in life, that you would give us wisdom. That these conversations would be full of grace, seasoned with salt. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.